I am your host, James Leonard, joined by my co-host,
Timmy.
And this week is going to be a fabulous podcast because we're joined by the wonderful Dr. Sharon Lambert from UCC. How are you, Sharon?
Hi, how are you? Thanks so much for having me.
What
Very
do you
excited.
what do you think of our gaff?
This is just super amazing and impressive and really professional and well done. It's fantastic, and I've really enjoyed the podcast for the last few weeks.
Great.
I'm delighted that you thought I could come on. So thank you.
No, we couldn't.
We're delighted to have you, Sharon. You know, myself and James, we've followed a little bit of your work, and it's really helped me on a personal level with my own stuff, and I'm sure it's helped James as well. You know, so thank you very much.
Yeah, we couldn't have a podcast on addiction without having Sharon Lambert on.
So we're like mutual stalkers. We're stalking each other without knowing it.
Yeah. But when we decided to do the podcast, you were the first person I rang to come on, if you can remember. It's before lockdown, you know, I was like, have to have Sharon on because you explain the causes of addiction and complex kind of psychological stuff in accessible language that I think that everybody should know about. You know, I think in addiction, we might think that all our problems are self-made or we all make bad choices, but sometimes there's forces at play that we've no control over that shape how we behave. And we'll get to that. But first, can we agree on a term? I know you don't like the term addict or clean and stuff like that. So can we talk about that for a few minutes?
And I know it's difficult for me to say that because for people who are in recovery, there the language that you use, and James and I had a row about this a couple of weeks ago. But I suppose, you know, you're entitled to use whatever terms you're comfortable with. And I guess my concern is for people who don't understand the path that you've walked, using words like that gives a certain image of an individual. So if you say addict to somebody who maybe doesn't know somebody who's been in addiction, they mightn't understand the huge emotional pain that somebody has been on. So for me, the word addict does not bring in everything that you need to know. What has the person's story been? How hard was the journey that they walked on? So if even if you think about your own stories, social exclusion and poverty and marginalisation and poor access to education are all things that are bad for people's mental health. And sometimes when people have poor mental health, if they can't access the services that they need, they use substances to help alleviate the pain. And I just don't feel for me that the word addict gives the whole context. I think that it's a stereotyped word, and that's why I'm uncomfortable with it. Now, I know people in recovery use that word to describe themselves, and I do get a little twinge, as you know, when I hear the word. I feel uncomfortable with it. But it's your life story and your lived experience, and you're entitled to use that language. For me, that's not my journey. I wasn't in addiction. I'm not in recovery. So for me, I suppose it's an academic debate, and I'm interested in how you take away the stigma for the general public. And addict for me just holds a lot of stigma. Yeah. And I absolutely detest the word clean. I hate it because the opposite of clean is
dirty.
And I don't think anybody who is using drugs is dirty. I think they're vulnerable. And I think that they are in a lot of emotional pain. And I don't like that word. And I really, really don't like it when people use that word in services or in court settings, when they talk about somebody producing a clean urine or somebody has been clean for 12 months. It some way insinuates that before that and prior to that, that they were dirty. And I've watched all of your podcasts up to date. You've been really honest about the vulnerabilities that you had and the situations that you were in that contributed to the decisions that you've made. And when you were using, for me, you would not have been dirty. You would have been people who would have been in pain and who were reaching out for help. So that's, that's the issue I have. And one of the things is that I personally feel that addiction is a mental health issue. I don't think it's a criminal justice issue. And if you think about depression and anxiety, 20 years ago in Ireland, they had a lot of stigma and people didn't talk about their mental health issues. And we've moved forward now, and we're always saying to people it's important to talk about your mental health. But for me, there's still a lot of stigma associated with addiction. And if addiction is to be considered a health issue, then it means there shouldn't be any stigma. So, if I go to a hospital tomorrow and I say I'm really depressed and I'm really struggling, and somebody else comes in and they say, I'm using opiates or I'm taking tablets or whatever it is and I'm really struggling. For me, both of us are presenting with mental health issues and we deserve the same treatment and the same care. And it concerns me that the language that we use around addiction generates stigma.
Yeah, I think you make good point there around addict giving no kind of room for context. Like in recovery or in the rooms, in recovery rooms, they say, I always understood addiction as to be the act of using the drug. But the problem is way deeper. Like the addiction, as I understood it, the addiction manifests itself in drug use. But the problem is not drug use. Like since I came into recovery, I've been around loads of drugs. I've worked in homeless services, worked with addicts. There we go again. But now working with drug users, and I've been in the presence of people who are using. I never wanted to use the drug. Why? Because I was after addressing the underlying issue. That tells me the problem was never the drug in the first place. It wasn't. And I think maybe something like somebody who uses drugs, like in an eating disorder, this person has an eating disorder. Don't call them food addicts, I think we have to leave some room for context. But I think then as well for people in recovery that go to NNA, because this is the free stuff that's available, a recovering addict is kind of like an identity that they wear, and it kind of builds camaraderie and kind of it's good for social groups and finding new pairs. I'm not a junkie or I'm not a scumbag. These are the labels, and I suppose we become used to carrying labels, and addict is another one. And and I'm always open to change, and I'm always open to learn a new way. So when you spoke to me like that, I began to think critically of how I was actually describing myself. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, that word junkie is like the way you hate addict. I have family members that are heroin addicts, and I've often been in the company of people and they'd speak about somebody that's in heroin addiction or something else in that nature, and they'd call them a junkie, and for me that word really, really hits here, because I understand what it's like to be somebody addicted to drugs, alcohol, gambling, and I know why I was addicted to these things, and I know as well why these people are addicted to they're blocking out all that pain, the emotional pain, and that's probably stemmed from childhood or whenever, and it's a very, very, very hard thing for me to really get my head around at times. Sometimes I've just walked away from certain people's company that have used that kind of language, and so I understand.
And that makes me really sad when I hear people using a word like junkie.
Yeah.
Because what you're saying is that you're a bad person. Mm-hmm. And as somebody who has worked in addiction services, and my research now is in the area, I have met very few bad people. I have met lots of people who were very sad and who were very hurt, but I have met very, very few bad people. And when I hear somebody saying the word junkie and putting that identity on somebody, it just makes me so sad that somebody might even identify themselves. And I remember working with young people, and sometimes they would use those words to describe, you'd say, why do you think you've come in to see me today? And they'd say, because I'm a junkie. And to hear a 15 or a 16-year-old identify themselves as that. So for me, like, obviously I know James a little bit longer than I know you, Timmy, but for me, James is not an addict. James is James. And he's, this super bright man that I know from being a student in UCC. And you're this, gifted builder. So, I don't know you from your past. I only know you from now. And your identity to me and your identity to yourselves is different. So that's my issue with the terminology, is that when you say the word addict, what do people see in their head? And I think they see somebody who's lying on the street, howling at the moon.
Yeah.
And when I see somebody lying on the street whose behavior is difficult to watch, I look and I say, I wonder what their pain was that they need to be here. Because, you know, when you see somebody in that situation and people say, oh, that's the choices that they've made, do they look like they're having a good time? They're not. They're in deep emotional pain. And if there's any way it could be different, they would try. But because their emotional pain is so deep, they need to medicate themselves just to be able to put one foot in front of the other. So that's my issue with that terminology. I think it's stigmatizing.
Yeah, and when you're talking there about medicating yourself, that's what I done. Like when I started off using, you know, I was a young person and I thought I was doing it for, you know, my mum used to say to me, what are you doing, what are you doing? And some teachers or whatever, youth workers, what are you doing? Just thought I liked the buzz of it. But it wasn't actually. I was actually medicating myself because my mental health was so bad at the time. And looking back, I would have had suicidal ideation, you know, around 18, 19, 20 especially. If I didn't have the drugs at that time, I'd probably be dead today. Them drugs helped me survive that time, you know. And even though my quality of life was shit, I was still alive. And like I worked with people in addiction and especially people in homeless services. And you're thinking, all they have in this world is the drug. You take that drug away from them and they're going into the river. Because how else can you survive such a harsh reality?
Yeah, it's a fair point. I could definitely agree with you there. Because I often said, I think I said it in the first podcast, that without drugs or anything at all to take me away from the emotional pain I was going through, I possibly would have taken my own life, because I didn't know how to handle the emotional pain. I didn't even know what it was because I had absolutely no awareness. I was so caught up in my head. I wasn't able to focus or give my attention to anything else, only all the negative stuff that was going on in my head. You're not good, you're bad, you're stupid, you know, nobody likes you, you know. And I had all these trust issues at the time as well, that I couldn't give anybody any form of trust, and I could leave myself go a little bit, you know. And when alcohol and drugs came into my life, all that changed. You know, I was able to talk to my first girl for the first time. Never spoke to a girl. I would die. I'd literally die. And other things then, but with that then, Sharon, came the violence. You know, the violence came out in my life then, and the attitude towards people, because I started building a bit of an ego for myself then, because I was being, I started creating an image as a big, strong, handy fella, you know, which was, there was positive and negative effects to that. You know, the positive was I was kind of left alone by bigger and older fellas, but the negative then is I was getting a lot of negative attention in my area and things like that. So yeah.
There's a couple of things that you said there that I think are really important. So, you know, James, you said about, you know, the focus on the drugs. If drugs were the problem, everybody who uses drugs would develop a dependency or an addiction. They don't. No. Lots of people use drugs. People have always used mind-altering substances. There are some people who, when they use drugs, cannot stop because it gives you something that you need that you don't have within yourself at the moment. And then, you know, Timmy, you were talking about the violence. And I know that, you know, you've spoken about that in the podcast about the regrets you have around that behavior. And for me, when I listen to it, it sounds like that was really important behavior that you needed to keep yourself not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. Because while you might present to the outside world as the hard man, inside you were feeling very low and very wounded. And in order to feel emotionally safe so that nobody could get in there, you had to use these behaviors for survival. So, you know, when we think about psychological trauma, you know, people who've lived in poverty and been excluded, and you've both been honest about the fact that your stories have been difficult when you were children, that can have an impact on how you manage stress. There's a dog barking in the background.
I can hear him, yeah.
We will.
I'll fix him after. I'm
Yeah.
only joking. To the animal lovers, I'm only kidding.
Just in case anybody who's listening thinks that we haven't heard it and they think their house is there, but
he probably sees a bird on the roof now or something like that.
But you know, for people who've experienced a lot of what we call childhood adversity or toxic stress, it primes you. It tells you that you're in danger. When you're small, you say, oh, the world is a bit scary. So whether that's because there might be violence in your home or there might be violence in your community. So we have a fight or flight response system. So that fight or flight response system is there to keep you alive. So some of the behaviors that you feel shameful about now are actually behaviors that were there to protect you and keep you alive. And yes, they did hurt you. And yes, they did hurt other people. But for the fact that you had them, you know, you said yourself, where would you be? And one of the things I think, particularly young men, is that, you know, biologically, there's a lot of stuff going on in the body as well. So a lot of the stuff that sometimes is going on is actually normal. And then if you throw some stress in on top of it, you can have a huge stress response. So that fight or flight system is more active than it should be. So even at times when you're safe, your brain actually thinks that you're in danger and it triggers your fight or flight response system. So some people flight and they run away and they disappear and they hide under their duvet covers and they don't come out into the world. And obviously for society and professionals, that's a much easier group to work with. They don't cause you any problems. For people who go into fight mode to survive, you see it, you hear them coming before you see them. And people find that really difficult to work with. But actually, if you take a step back and you take a deep breath and you say, rather than looking at the behavior, and you take a deep breath and you say, I wonder what's happened. I wonder what has happened that this person needs to present as very aggressive in order to feel safe. So another word I have a problem with, particularly in relation to young people, is challenging behavior. I think that it's adaptive behavior. So if you have a child who lives in an environment where they feel quite frightened, and then you take them and you put them into a school, they still feel frightened. They don't know that this environment is different and that they're safer here. They still have that behavior. And what adults sometimes see is challenging behavior. But what the child is telling you with their behavior is, I'm finding it really hard to manage my world. I don't know how to communicate that to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off because I'm scared. And all they want is for somebody to see, because they don't have the language around it. So they can't say I'm scared. They feel it though. Their whole body feels it. And that's why they react. And as adults, we should be able to take a step back and say, I wonder what this is about, instead of focusing on the behaviour in the child, about wondering what's that about.
I remember when I was in secondary school particularly, and I spoke about this last week or a couple of weeks ago, like I was a bright boy. I was a very bright boy and I enjoyed learning and I enjoyed certain subjects like history, English, whatever. But in secondary school, because of, I suppose, my mental state at the time, I wasn't able to concentrate, you know. And but none of the teachers down there, they never come over and ask you what's wrong, or it was always, but you're bold, scumbag, tug, scut. That's kind of what we were told. And we were put into class, 7 or 8 of us, and we were just left there up until the leaving cert. No massing us really. But looking back now, you know, as an adult, everything I know now through psychology and sociology and all, philosophy and everything, I'm looking back now and I'm looking at, well, who else was in the class that had a load of potential and that weren't able to realise it. You know, I've been to some people that my age have died in the meantime, do you know what I mean? And there's a huge onus on the teacher, and even in the prison service. Like the prison officer has a lot of contact with the prisoners on the landing. And if they were any bit informed, like we talk about trauma informed, if they're any bit aware of this type of stuff, they could actually pinpoint the challenging prisoner or the challenging child and put more energy into them instead of focusing on the star pupil, let's say, because they need less attention anyway. You know, but I think the system is set up in a way as reward those who are already good and, you know, kind of disregard those who find it more difficult. But I think, you know, certainly in when I spoke at a senior management conference in the Cork ETB, just before lockdown, principals now and CEOs and stuff like, and they asked me a question: if there was one thing if there was one thing you could say to influence senior management, and I says, have your teachers trauma informed, have them trained in this type of stuff, and because there's a lot of potential going untapped, and the teacher has a lot of contact hours with a child.
Because sometimes I struggle to, when I see an adult, particularly with children, where a child is misbehaving or has challenging behaviour, and if I see an adult kind of struggling to deal with that, I can get frustrated and annoyed. But I have to remind myself that most people haven't had the opportunity to study psychology like I have. So when they look, they don't. They that's what they see. You see bold and challenging. But, you know, anybody who works with children, when you tell a small child that you're proud of them, how tall they stand, they can go from 2 foot to 6 foot in 30 seconds. When you're constantly down on the child and, you know, they must do better and they must do better, there's very little growth in that. I suppose I'm not here to defend any other professions, and I'm often quite critical of a lot of professions. I know that Ireland has one of the highest staff teacher ratio in Europe for primary school. So I can imagine that it must be very difficult if you haven't been taught about trauma, and then you're in a class with 30 children and you're like, I can't do this. And then when you're talking about adults who present as challenging, when you have an adult man who's kicking off, and that's what you see, if you're not trained in trauma, what you see kicking off and you feel in danger. And then what happens is you have two people who are feeling stressed and traumatized. They're going to butt heads. And even for me, when I've worked in services where people might come in angry, there are days when I find it harder, and I might be really, in my head, be really cross. Who does he think he is coming in here wrecking the place and talking to us like that? I'm going to kill him. And then, you know, because I might have got up in the morning, there was no milk for the coffee, and I've left the house like I want to shoot somebody. And then, you know, then you have another day where you go in and you're in, all peace and love. I'm, or some kind of earth mother, and somebody comes in and they're calling you a CUNT and they're kicking the door. And you're like, come into me and tell me what is wrong. God love us, come in and don't be shouting and give it out. So I think there's, it's about educating staff, and also not only just educating, but supporting them. Because one of the things I think that people forget about is that, and I know you talk a lot about your own area and the area you grew up in, but actually trauma is quite common, and it happens in a lot of houses. And it's not just in houses where there's poverty. Do people maybe with more money hide it better because they have better resources? Possibly. Certainly being in poverty and being excluded from education increases your trauma experiences because you've less options. But you might meet a professional who actually lived with domestic violence as a child. And then when you have an adult who comes in and they're being challenging because they're frightened, the professional in that case might actually be taken back to when they were a child. So sometimes I am judgmental about the way people are treated, and I have to remind myself actually that I don't know the professional story either. And so it's two things. It's teaching them about trauma, and then making sure that your workforce are supported so that your workforce are also emotionally safe, because a lot of people have their own stories too.
Yeah, it just shows how important it is as well, if you're working with individuals or working with people, to know your own triggers and have some personal development on yourself, because when I do recruit prison officer training, myself and Sheila from the Cork Alliance, we go up to recruits every month. There's a different group, and we just do a workshop with them. And like what you were saying there, if you're met with an adult that's irate, like the last thing you want to do is meet him irate. It's not personal on you. That uniform could represent so much. Like if he's been going up to prison visiting his father or his brother, and now he's in prison, and what the Navy uniform represents, it's nothing against the individual officer. He's having a rant, he's having a moment, he's in prison, whatever is going on in his life wasn't great. He's in prison. Leave him have the rant and come back the next day. And you don't have to be nice, but just it's not personal on you, and that will make your job so much easier. But what I've seen, and Timmy probably seen it as well, officers that get engaged in conflict with prisoners, and then it ends up in fights, and there's tension on the landing and everything. So hopefully the new prison service ethos, or the new ethos of the Irish prison services around having more informed, more compassionate officers, which creates a healthier landing.
I think that course yourself and Sheila done would be very helpful, just to show prison officers that a lot of the prisoners in the prison have had really, really difficult childhoods and stuff, and a lot of them are there because of stuff that happened in their younger years, and they probably weren't taught how to treat people right, or like my own. Like I listened to one of your past podcasts there with somebody else, and you spoke about a child going into school, and if there's stuff going on at home for that child, they're going into school, they're not going to be able to sit down and listen to the teacher and take in information because they're worried about what they may be going home to later on, and that really, really hit home for me, because that was who I was, and I don't think, I will say this, I don't think there's anyone bad. There's no teacher bad. There's no prison officer bad. They're just uneducated in terms of why people are the way they are. That would be my idea in it. You teach. I actually watched another thing about you. I'm fascinated with at this stage. But there's something that you do a lot of work on. It's called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. Will you tell us a small bit about that, please, Sharon?
Yeah, so I suppose the term has become quite popular in the last few years, but it's not, the science behind it isn't new. So, we've known for a long time that when you have a lot of stress, that it affects your physical health and it affects your mental health. And if your mental health is affected, you're at risk for substance dependence. And if you're at risk for substance dependence, you're at risk for other issues like crime and homelessness. So a number of years ago, a guy in the States, in the Centre for Disease Control, we hearing all about CDC lately now with coronavirus. So the CDC in the States, they did a very large study where they looked at ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, in people's lives, and they used a questionnaire that had 10 questions on it. So the questions were broken down into abuse, different types of abuse, and neglect, and other issues in the home, like living with a parent with a mental health issue, or living with a parent who was using substances. And they asked those 10 questions. And what they found was that people who had scored 4, well, I suppose one of the first things they found was that actually a lot of people have stuff. In the general population, a lot of people would have 1 or 2 of those items. But what they found then was people who had maybe 4 or more of those were at higher risk for physical illness and mental illness and other negative life events. So why is that then? So when you're born, only 20% of your brain is fully formed. The rest of your brain isn't fully formed until you're somewhere between the age of 23 and 25. Men are a little bit slower than women at the old catching up on the brain.
I agree.
And by the time you're 4, your brain has reached about 70% of what it will be by the time you're an adult. So if you're living with, in a house where one of your parents is very stressed and they're struggling, they might not, when you cry, they might not be able to look after you straight away because they're so stressed themselves. So when you leave a child then crying for a long time, that's stress. Because, if you think about when you were an adult, when you're stressed, say if, God forbid something was going on in my life and somebody was very ill. I had a daughter in hospital early this year, so that would have caused me a lot of stress. Like as an adult, I can ring people and say, my workplace or whatever, and I can say, I can't come in today because I'm actually struggling today because I'm finding the situation very stressful. But if you think about a child, they don't go into school in the morning and why wouldn't I go to work when I'm stressed? Because I couldn't concentrate. I might cry. I might get cross with people. It would be better for me to be at home, and that's what I need right now. And I can get those needs met. If I'm a child, I'm going to be farmed into school. And if I'm having exactly the same feelings as Sharon Lambert, the adult down the road, is having, I'm not going to go in and say, guys, today's not really a good day for me. Not feeling it. I probably need to lie down under a quilt for a couple of hours and people bring me stuff and make me feel better. But we don't. We keep going and we think that they're going to be okay. And when you do that, then the behavior gets worse and worse and worse. And then people say, I can't handle this. And then they start to get excluded. So that's the adverse childhood experiences. We know now that there are, thousands of studies, I'd say at this stage, that have shown the link between higher levels of adversity in childhood and other issues. And it's not because people are bad people, but the more stress you put on somebody, their tolerance level for stress gets smaller. So if you're in, yourself, when you get up in the morning, you've had a great morning, there's milk for the coffee, the kids are fighting, you've got petrol in the car when you get into it and you're not running late and you're driving down the road and some fella pulls out in front of you and he starts blowing the horn and giving you the finger and you're like, all right, buddy, chill. Another morning you get up and there's no milk and the kids are fighting and you get into the car and the petrol light is on and you're late for something, you're driving down the road and the same fella pulls out in front of you and he blows the horn and you're like, okay, bring it on, Yeah. So that's our tolerance of stress. But the more stress you put on people, their tolerance level starts to get smaller and smaller. So something that, a small child might go into school and it might be something as simple as get out your lunch boxes. And if they're finding it really hard to concentrate anyway, and they're stressed and worried about that, something that you think is really small might be a really big deal for them because they're done. The straw that broke the camel's back happened a year ago. And now they have no space left for any more of the stress that you're going to give them. So then all you see is this behavior. My issue with sometimes when people talk about ACEs, my issue with that is that the original study used those 10 items. And those 10 items place all of the blame within the family home. And everything that happens in a family home happens in the context of the society that we live in. So poverty is not a choice. People are in poverty because they are not getting access in a fair way to other opportunities. So poverty is a structural societal problem that is caused by government policies. And that's an adverse experience on children. The biggest predictor of depression is poverty. And if you have a mom who's got a couple of kids and there's very little money, she's not going to be sitting around at the kitchen table singing Kumbaya and doing crochet with the kids because her head is all over the place. She's thinking about where she's going to get food this week and she's stressed. And when you're a stressed parent, you shout more. And when you're a stressed parent, you shout more, you feel bad about yourself. And maybe you need to drink a bit to make yourself feel better. And now that drink is going to be working. So to say that all of those adversities happen in the home and that there's nothing else to blame for it, only that the people living in that house are not good people, that's not true.
Do you know, you done research for Cork Simon community, and you done a profile of the people that was using the service, and compared to the general population, they scored way higher in terms of adverse childhood experiences. Do you know, like sometimes people can have this kind of moralistic view of addiction. Do you think that the A study is the counter argument to that? Like, as in terms of some people think that, and you'd see it a lot online, just say, no, it's his own fault, he chose to pick up, you know, but when you learn about somebody has been brought up in poverty in a single parent family with a big load of siblings, or their parent in prison or a brother in prison, or they've been abused, and all these multiply the chances of ending up in homelessness, then the moralistic argument doesn't hold weight anymore, really.
You know, when you think about the ads for children's services where people are asking you to donate money for the children who need you, and you know, when you see that picture of that child and your heart breaks and you say, right, I'm going to give them a few bob. The adult that you see on the street who's using a homeless service, who's using drugs and alcohol and who's committing crime because they have to in order to survive. That's them.
That's them, yeah.
That's that child. And and sometimes when you see somebody, it can be very easy when you see an adult who's behaving in a particular way that just to watch it can be distressing. It can make you upset to watch somebody behaving like that. I always say to myself, that's that child. Only they didn't get there quick enough. And I think that, but for the fact that some people have used drugs, and both of you have said that about, the suicidal thinking. For some people, when I meet people who are using drugs, I think you're amazing because you found something that allowed you to be able to put one foot in front of the other. Unfortunately for you, the thing that you used that made you feel better in the start is not working so good anymore. And it's causing you so much pain and so much pain for other people. And when people say about, people who use drugs and crime and blah, 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 there is nobody who uses drugs and who's committing crime. There is nobody who feels as bad about themselves as the person who's doing it. And I can guarantee you, there is nobody who will pay for it as much as the person. So that's what I always try to say to myself when people say those things. I say, that's the child that you wanted to give a tenner to last week.
Yeah. Mentality is the same, because I remember when I initially gave up drugs and stuff, I literally couldn't have a conversation with another adult because I didn't have the vocabulary anyway. But I always felt really insecure. I couldn't get a sentence together. And can you just explain it? Why people like me who use drugs at a really young age stopped using when I hit 31, but I still felt like a child?
Because when you're a child and you're developing, you're learning new skills. So, when you let your child go to the shop to buy milk on their own and you're afraid that something will happen to them, but what you're doing is you're saying, right, this is their chance to build their confidence and their independence and their self-esteem. So if I remember correctly, I think you started using when you were 12 or 13. Yeah. So that's a really important time, your adolescence, for learning adult skills, how to talk to people, how to negotiate your way out of problems. So because you probably don't remember a lot of that time, what was your skill development? So all of a sudden now you wake up one day and you're an adult and you've lost those opportunities. Yeah, you learned skills, but they're not so good at the moment. But I think that the really important thing, and that's what I love about your podcast, is that despite all of that adversity, despite how awful a situation can seem, there is absolutely hope. And all you have to do is have one person who believes in you. And if the rest of us could be a little bit more compassionate, so that when we do see, I know for people experiencing homelessness, people walk past and they don't even make eye contact. And I've sat on the street with people who are experiencing homelessness, and you feel so small. And you're looking up and these people are looking down at you. And I remember one time sitting with somebody I knew who was experiencing homelessness. And I wanted to say when people pass it, I'm actually Dr. Sharon Lambert from UCC, because I felt so bad. Yeah. I felt so worthless sitting there, and I felt like I needed to tell people that I wasn't. And then I went, can you imagine what it's like to do this every single day? So if people, when they're walking down the street, who see people who are using drugs or see people whose behaviour is difficult to watch, just check in with yourself and know that you're safe in that moment, and just be curious. Be curious and say, I wonder what's happened, and I wonder what's going on for that person. And remember that they're somebody's child. They might be somebody's father or mother, and they might be a brother and sister. And they were once that child on the front of that box that you wanted to give money to. They didn't make it at that time, but now they're asking you if you can help them to make it now. So that's what I think is having a little bit of self-belief and having a little people around you who are kinder and more compassionate. Instead of punching down, reach your hand down to lift somebody up.
Perfect. That's fantastic. And like that, when I was on the Tommy Tiernan show, and I was explaining to Tommy, the people that you see on the street, they're somebody's sons and daughters. Some of them have sons and daughters themselves. They're very hurt individuals, and we look down on them like they're the worst in society, when they actually need the most care and the most compassion and kindness. But you know what? Hopefully this podcast helps to open people's eyes. I think you've explained the roots of addiction fabulously, and I hope people get something from it. So thanks for having us on, and I've really enjoyed it. What about you, Tim?
I did. It's very informative. Thank you very much, Sharon.
Thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks so much, guys.
No problem. And thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm sure you enjoyed that as well. If you have any questions for myself and Timmy, Twitter and Facebook, Sharon is on Twitter as well. We'll only take nice comments, please. But I'm sure you enjoyed it. Thanks again for watching, liking, subscribing. The feedback for this show has been fantastic. We certainly, Timmy, are overwhelmed. A lot of hurt people contacting us looking for help and support. I hope those people are doing well. I want to thank the 11 people that subscribe to our Patreon. You help us with the costs, and if you want to subscribe to that, just head over to our Twitter. It's a pinned tweet, and you can subscribe for €1, €2, whatever, and it just helps us kind of keep the show rolling. So thanks again, Sharon. Thanks, Timmy. We are the Two Norries podcast, powered by Unity Media Network, and next week we will see you with Katrina Toomey from Penny Dinners. Slán.
Thank you.
This episode is sponsored by local entrepreneur Danny O'Donovan of QuickMinutes.com. QuickMinutes is a specialised meeting management application that streamlines the administrative process in running a meeting.